Aliens tortured the human girl until she died. 37 minutes later, she returned, reaches its dramatic apex when Mara's heart finally stops after unbearable pain. The aliens celebrate their victory, only for the monitors to spike with impossible readings. Darkness engulfs the chamber, broken by golden light emanating from Mara's levitating body. She awakens transformed, shattering her restraints with a thought, ready to teach her tormentors through art rather than vengeance. The grand hall of the Arinthian tribunal loomed vast and imposing, an architectural marvel built from crystallized dark matter shards and molecular glass that caught the light of distant stars and refracted it in 1,000 directions. The citadel orbited silently in the void, removed from any planetary influence, a fitting location for those who considered themselves above the petty concerns of gravity-bound species. Today, the hall buzzed with unusual activity as delegates from 100 worlds gathered for what promised to be a spectacle of justice during the tribunal's millennium celebration of conquest. Lieutenant Mara Novak stood in the center of the chamber, her wrists bound by gravitational shackles that suspended her slightly above the polished obsidian floor. Despite her predicament, she maintained the rigid posture of an Earth Alliance officer, her dark eyes scanning the alien faces that surrounded her with cold calculation rather than fear. Her black uniform, torn in places from the violent ambush that had separated her from the diplomatic envoy, Aurora's Grace, still bore the silver insignia of humanity's interstellar fleet. High Arbiter Korvash, a towering figure with skin like burnished copper and eyes that glowed with the cold light of ancient stars, approached the suspended human. The assembled delegates fell silent. Even the air seemed to still itself in anticipation. Lieutenant Mara Novak of Earth Alliance vessel, Aurora's Grace. Korvash's voice resonated through the chamber without the need for amplification, a natural evolutionary advantage that served to intimidate lesser beings. You stand accused of espionage against the Arinthian tribunal and cosmic heresy for your claims of human resilience and adaptability. Mara's lips curved into the faintest smile. I stated only facts. Arbiter. Humans have survived extinction events, adapted to hostile environments, and thrived despite all odds. This is not heresy. It is history. A ripple of discomfort passed through the assembly. The Petrashar delegates, crystalline entities that communicated through light frequencies, pulsed with agitation. The gaseous representatives of the etheric myriads contracted in what might have been disgust. Korvash's eyes narrowed to luminescent slits. Your species' arrogance is matched only by its fragility. You claim resilience, yet your biological form can be destroyed by the simplest means. He made a gesture with his long, six-fingered hand, and a panel slid open in the floor, revealing a platform that rose slowly to reveal an array of devices that gleamed with malevolent purpose. The tribunal has decreed a live extraction procedure, Korvash announced, his voice carrying notes of anticipation that bordered on pleasure. We will harvest your pain and fear as proof of human inferiority. Your suffering will serve as entertainment and education for all assembled. The chief scientist of the tribunal, a being named Vrel, stepped forward. Unlike most of the assembled aliens, Vrel's appearance was almost humanoid, save for the metallic scales that covered their skin and the additional set of smaller arms that emerged from below their primary limbs. They approached the platform with clinical interest, adjusting settings on the various devices. Fascinating, Vrel murmured, studying Mara with the detached curiosity of a researcher examining a specimen. I've never had the opportunity to study human pain responses in detail. The extraction should provide excellent data. From the audience, Security Captain Malor watched with the stern expression expected of their position. As head of the tribunal's enforcement division, Malor had overseen countless punishments. But something about this particular proceeding stirred an unfamiliar discomfort in their conscience. Before the procedure could begin, Mara raised her head and addressed the assembly, her voice clear and unwavering. Record this well, delegates of the tribunal. What you witness today will not be the story of human weakness, but of human adaptation. We do not break, we transform. Her words were met with derisive clicks, hisses, and the electronic equivalents of laughter from the various species present. Only one delegate, a slender figure named Entral from the Outer Rim worlds, observed with an expression that might have been interpreted as concern, their six-fingered hands quietly activating a personal recording device. Vrel approached Mara with a set of razor-thin nanite probes that hovered in the air like metallic insects. These will interface directly with your nervous system, they explained, with inappropriate professional courtesy. The gravitic clamps will prevent unconsciousness. You will experience everything. The probes descended, piercing Mara's skin with surgical precision. She clenched her jaw but made no sound as the devices established their connections to her nerve endings. The gravitic clamps materialized around her head, invisible forces that would keep her brain functioning regardless of the trauma her body endured. Begin extraction at standard parameters, Corvash commanded. Vrel activated the system with a series of precise gestures. Mara's body went rigid as the first wave of pain coursed through her. Her face contorted. But she did not scream. Not yet. The assembled delegates watched with various expressions of interest and satisfaction. The Petra Shard representatives pulsed in crystalline dread, absorbing the emotional emanations that filled the chamber. The etheric myriads, sensitive to temporal disturbances, began to detect unusual ripples in the space-time around the human prisoner. Minutes passed. Mara's vital signs displayed on holographic monitors above the extraction platform showed escalating stress markers. But something unusual was happening. The indicators for pain response began to plateau instead of continuing to rise. Anomaly detected, Vrel announced, their voice carrying notes of scientific curiosity. The subject's neural pathways are adapting, reconfiguring in response to the stimulus. Increase extraction power by 30%, Corvash ordered dismissively. Humans are known to have temporary endurance mechanisms. They will fail. Vrel complied, adjusting the controls. The probes glowed brighter, and Mara finally screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the grand hall. Several of the more sensitive delegates withdrew slightly, uncomfortable with the raw emotion that permeated the chamber. Interesting, Vrel murmured, studying the readouts with fascination. The chamber sensors are detecting quantum fluctuations around her neural spike. I've never observed this phenomenon before. Captain Meller stepped closer to the monitoring station, professional interest overriding their earlier discomfort. Could it be a malfunction in the equipment? Impossible, Vrel replied. The systems were calibrated this morning. They adjusted several more settings, tuning the electrodes to harvest the endorphins that Mara's body was producing in response to the pain. These readings suggest her consciousness is somehow expanding. In the audience, Delegate Entral leaned forward, recording every measurement and observation with growing interest. Their species had long studied the theoretical limits of sentient adaptation, but had never witnessed such a dramatic real-time example. 20 minutes into the procedure, the anomalies increased. Spatial distortions began to manifest around Mara's suspended form, minute ripples in reality that the most sensitive instruments could barely detect. Vrel reported these findings to High Arbiter Corvash, who dismissed them with contemptuous wave. Your instruments are malfunctioning. Scientist Vrel, no biological entity can affect spatial dimensions through mere suffering. Continue the extraction at maximum capacity. Vrel hesitated only momentarily before complying. Maximum extraction initiated, Arbiter. The intensity of the procedure doubled. Mara's screams gave way to a chilling silence as her body contorted in agony beyond vocalization. Yet, her eyes remained open, fixed on Corvash, with an unnerving steadiness that made even the High Arbiter uncomfortable. At the 30-minute mark, Mara's lips moved, forming words that the chamber's audio sensors amplified for all to hear. "What doesn't kill us makes us stronger." The ancient human proverb echoed through the hall, causing confusion among the delegates, unfamiliar with Earth philosophies. Corvash stepped forward, irritation evident in his glowing eyes. "Your species' primitive aphorisms will not save you, human. Your suffering serves the tribunal's purpose." 35 minutes into the procedure, the anomalies became impossible to ignore. The lights throughout the Grand Hall flickered erratically. Gravity wells destabilized momentarily, causing several delegates to float inches above their seats before settling back down. The holographic monitors displaying Mara's vital signs began to glitch, showing impossible readings. "Arbiter, I strongly recommend we terminate the extraction," Vrel urged, their multiple arms working frantically across control panels. "These readings indicate a cascade failure in the system, possibly in reality itself around the subject." "Nonsense," Corvash snapped, though uncertainty had begun to creep into his voice. "Continue until full extraction is complete." At precisely the 37-minute mark, Mara Novak's heart stopped. The monitors flatlined with a sustained tone that filled the chamber. High Arbiter Corvash stepped forward with a satisfied expression. "Let the record show that the human subject survived 37 minutes of standard extraction before biological failure. A respectable duration, but ultimately proof of their species' limitations. The procedure is complete." The announcement was met with murmurs of approval from many delegates. Captain Malor moved to order the removal of the body, but Vrel raised all four hands in alarm. "Wait, the readings. This can't be possible." The flatlined monitor spiked suddenly, showing a heartbeat that defied all medical understanding. Not the erratic pattern of resuscitation, but a perfect, powerful rhythm that sent the instruments into overdrive. The lights throughout the Grand Hall failed completely, plunging the chamber into darkness, broken only by the emergency illumination strips along the floor, and a growing golden luminescence that emanated from Mara's body. Her form rose higher, the gravitational shackles no longer restraining but seemingly supporting her as she levitated in the center of the hall. The golden light intensified, forcing many delegates to shield their eyes or sensory organs. When visibility returned, Mara Novak was transformed. Her eyes blazed with the same golden light that surrounded her body. The nanite probes and extraction devices had disintegrated, leaving no mark on her now pristine uniform. With a thought that required no physical gesture, she shattered the gravitational shackles that had bound her. 37 minutes, she said, her voice resonating with harmonics that touched the minds of all present, rather than merely their auditory senses. 37 minutes of what you considered the ultimate suffering. What you fail to understand is that humans don't just endure pain, we learn from it. Reality warped around her. The solid walls of the Grand Hall became transparent, revealing the void of space beyond, not as a vacuum that would kill the assembled beings, but as a cosmic canvas stretched before them. Energy beams extended from Mara's fingertips, not as weapons, but as tools that reconfigured the chamber around them. High Arbiter Corvash found himself frozen in place, unable to flee or command his security forces. What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice stripped of its former authority. "What you could have done all along," Mara replied calmly. "Creating rather than destroying, teaching rather than torturing." The Grand Hall transformed before the astonished eyes of the delegates. The extraction platform sank back into the floor, replaced by a rising stage. The audience seating rearranged itself into a perfect amphitheater, with acoustic properties that would carry the softest whisper to every corner. "You sought to extract my pain for your entertainment," Mara continued, moving among the delegates, who found themselves unable to resist her gentle guidance. "Instead, I will give you something far more valuable: understanding. With graceful movements of her glowing hands, Mara assigned roles to her former tormentors. Corvash, Vrel, and Malor found themselves at the center of the stage, their bodies responding to an irresistible choreography. Around them, other delegates were drawn into the performance, forming tableaux that began to tell stories. You will perform the histories of those you have oppressed, Mara explained, as the unwilling actors moved through their assigned parts. You will feel their suffering, their hopes, their resilience, and through this shared experience, you will learn what torture could never teach you. The first performance began, a living portrayal of an early encounter between the Arinthian tribunal and a peaceful race from the Andromeda galaxy. The delegates turned actors experienced the fear of the invaded, the arrogance of the invaders. Tears fell from Corvash's eyes as he felt, for the first time, the terror his people had inflicted on countless worlds. Delegate and Trowel, who had been quietly recording the proceedings, found themselves appointed as the chronicler of this new form of diplomacy. They moved among the performances, capturing the transformative power of the stories being told. "This is madness," Captain Malor whispered to Vrel as they enacted a scene of displacement and refugee crisis. "She could destroy us all, yet she forces us to perform?" "Not forces," Vrel replied, understanding dawning in their scientific mind. "She's giving us the one thing we never gave her, a choice to understand rather than simply obey. This isn't revenge, it's rehabilitation." The performances continued for hours, each story revealing another layer of the complex interstellar history that had led to the tribunal's rise to power. Species that had been enemies for generations found themselves portraying each other's tragedies and triumphs, gaining perspectives they had never considered. As the final performance concluded, a portrayal of humanity's own violent past and subsequent evolution toward cooperation, Mara Novak stood at the center of the transformed hall, the golden light around her gently fading. "The extraction is complete," she announced, echoing Corvash's earlier proclamation, but infusing it with new meaning. Not of pain, but of truth. Not for entertainment, but for enlightenment. The delegates found themselves released from the compulsion to perform, but many remained on the stage, moved by the experiences they had shared. High Arbiter Corvash approached Mara with steps that lacked his former imperious stride. "You could have destroyed us," he stated simply. "That would have proven nothing except that power corrupts regardless of species," Mara replied. "Humans learned that lesson through millennia of our own mistakes." "What happens now?" asked Captain Malor, who had experienced a profound shift in perspective through the enforced performances. Mara smiled, a genuine expression far removed from the defiant curve of lips she had shown earlier. "That depends on what you've learned. The tribunal can continue as an instrument of oppression, or it can become something new, a gathering place for shared stories and genuine understanding." In the days that followed, word spread throughout the galaxy of the miracle at the Arinthian tribunal. How a human had died and returned. How torture had transformed into theater. How enemies had become storytellers. The Grand Hall remained configured as an amphitheater, and delegates who had come expecting a display of cruelty departed as messengers of a new possibility. Scientist Vrel devoted their considerable intellect to studying the phenomenon they now called the Novak effect, the capacity for consciousness to transcend its biological limitations under extreme circumstances. Their research led to new understandings of sentience itself, and eventually to technologies that facilitated empathic connection between disparate species. Captain Malor resigned from security operations and, with Mara's guidance, established a peacekeeping force based on principles of mediation and cultural exchange rather than intimidation. The former enforcer found greater fulfillment in preventing conflicts than in punishing transgressors. High Arbiter Corvash faced the most difficult transition. Centuries of wielding absolute authority had calcified his thinking. Yet the experience of performing the suffering his decisions had caused created fissures in his certainty. He retreated to a solitary chamber within the citadel, emerging weeks later with a proposal for restructuring the tribunal into a true forum for interspecies cooperation. Delegate Entral, whose quiet recordings had captured the entire transformation, became the chief archivist of what was now called the Arinthian Amphitheater. Their meticulous documentation ensured that future generations would understand the pivotal moment when torture gave way to testimony. 10 years after the event that changed the course of interstellar relations, the Arinthian Amphitheater had evolved into a traveling company that toured the galaxy, staging performances that bridged cultural divides and healed ancient wounds. The former Grand Hall had been disassembled, its components reconfigured into smaller, mobile theaters that could reach worlds the tribunal had once only approached with warships. Mara Novak, once a lieutenant in Earth's fleet, now served as the artistic director of this cosmic theater troupe. The golden luminescence manifested only rarely now, usually when she was deep in the creative process of developing a new performance. Her resurrection had marked her as something more than human in the eyes of many species. But she consistently redirected such reverence toward the collaborative work of understanding. The true miracle wasn't my return, she often told new audience members who came expecting supernatural displays. It was discovering that even the most hardened hearts can change when they truly experience another story. On the 10th anniversary of what historians now called the 37-minute transformation, a special performance was staged on a neutral world at the galaxy's edge. Representatives from every known sentient species attended, including several that had been at war for generations. The performance began with a recreation of Mara's torture, not with actual pain, but with choreographed movements and projected emotions that conveyed the essence of the experience. Many in the audience wept, including former High Arbiter Korvash, who now served as the company's lead performer. As the story unfolded to show the transformation of the tribunal and the decade of healing that followed, a palpable sense of possibility filled the amphitheater. Species that could not physiologically smile found other ways to express their hope. Ancient enemies reached tentative appendages toward one another in gestures of reconciliation. After the final bow, as the audience dispersed into the night, Mara stood at the edge of the amphitheater, looking up at the stars. Captain Malor, now Peace Coordinator Malor, joined her in contemplation. 10 years ago, I was following orders that would have ended your life, Malor said quietly. Now I cannot imagine a galaxy without your influence. It wasn't me, Mara replied, her gaze fixed on a distant point of light that flickered with unusual intensity. It was the stories. They were always there, waiting to be told. I was just the catalyst. Do you ever regret what happened, the pain you endured? Mara considered the question seriously. I don't remember the pain itself anymore, only the transformation it sparked. Pain is temporary, change can be eternal. Scientist Vrel approached, their scaled skin catching the starlight as they gestured toward the flickering star Mara had been watching. We've confirmed it, they said with excitement. A new civilization, just developing interstellar capacity. They're broadcasting art, music, and images as their first message to the cosmos. Then they're ready, Mara smiled. Prepare the company. Our next performance awaits. As the three stood together, once torturer, scientist, and victim, now united in purpose, the distant star pulsed again, as if in anticipation of the stories that would soon bridge the void between them. In the decades that followed, the legend of the human who died and returned spread throughout the galaxy and beyond. Some accounts exaggerated Mara's powers, claiming she could resurrect the dead or travel through time. Others focused on the political implications, crediting her with single-handedly reforming the once-feared tribunal. But the truth, as recorded in Entral's meticulous archives, was both simpler and more profound. A moment of extreme suffering had created the possibility for extreme compassion. The human capacity for adaptation, once dismissed as a biological curiosity, was now studied as a model for conscious evolution by species across the known universe. The Arinthian Amphitheater continued its mission long after the original participants had passed into history. Its performances evolved, incorporating new stories and techniques, but always returning to the central truth that had emerged from those 37 minutes of transformation. Understanding requires experience, and experience shared becomes art. On distant worlds where the original events were known only as myth, children of 100 species played at the Resurrection Game, taking turns portraying Mara Novak and her transformation. The details varied wildly. Sometimes she grew wings. Sometimes she turned into pure energy. Sometimes she spoke with the voice of the universe itself. But the moral remained consistent. Suffering endured with purpose could change not just the sufferer, but the entire world. Scholars debated the physiological mechanisms behind Mara's resurrection and subsequent abilities. Some proposed quantum theories involving consciousness as a fundamental force capable of reorganizing matter under extreme circumstances. Others suggested that the extraction procedure had accidentally activated dormant human potential that existed in all members of the species, but rarely manifested. Whatever the scientific explanation, the cultural impact was undeniable. The anniversary of the 37-minute transformation became a galactic holiday, celebrated not with revelry, but with performances and the exchange of personal stories. Even species that had once prided themselves on emotional detachment came to value the vulnerability of shared narrative. Lieutenant Mara Novak, who had long since abandoned military titles, but was now often referred to simply as the storyteller, continued to guide the amphitheater's mission into her later years. The golden luminescence that had once enveloped her entire being now manifested only as a subtle glow behind her eyes when she was deeply moved by a performance. On what would be her final tour, aged but still commanding in presence, Mara returned to Earth for the first time since her transformation. The home planet had changed in her absence, becoming more engaged with the wider galactic community, largely due to the respect her legend had earned for humanity. The performance on Earth was unlike any before it. Instead of recreating the torture and transformation, the company presented the stories of 100 worlds simultaneously, a tapestry of shared experience that reduced the audience to tears of recognition. Humans saw themselves in the struggles of crystalline entities. Gaseous beings resonated with the emotions of carbon-based life forms. Ancient enemies recognized their common hopes. After the performance, as Earth's 3 moons rose above the amphitheater, a young officer from the new Interspecies Diplomatic Corps approached Mara with reverence. "The stories say you died for 37 minutes," the young diplomat said. "Do you remember what was on the other side?" Mara, her hair now white but her eyes still sharp, smiled gently. "I remember everything and nothing. I remember that the boundaries we perceive, between life and death, between species, between enemy and friend, are less solid than we imagine. I remember that consciousness continues, transforms, adapts." "Is that what gave you the power to change the tribunal? Some knowledge from beyond?" "No." Mara shook her head. "The power was always here, in this reality, in the capacity for empathy that exists in all sentient beings, even those who have forgotten how to access it. My experience simply reminded me to look for it, even in those who seemed most devoid of compassion." The young diplomat considered this. "And the performances? Why theater instead of, I don't know, a more direct approach to diplomacy?" "Because politics speaks to the mind, but art speaks to the soul," Mara replied, quoting a principle that had become the amphitheater's motto. When we perform another's story, we temporarily become them. There is no more direct form of understanding. That night, after the audience and company had departed, Mara Novak stood alone under the stars that had witnessed her journey from captive to catalyst. The golden luminescence that had been her companion for decades began to spread from behind her eyes, gradually enveloping her entire form as it had on the day of her transformation. She made no attempt to control it this time, instead welcoming the familiar sensation of boundaries dissolving. When Peace Coordinator Malor found her the next morning, there was no body, only a shower of golden motes that hung in the air briefly before dispersing on the wind. The news spread across the galaxy. The storyteller had departed for her final performance. Some claimed she had ascended to another plane of existence. Others believed she had simply completed the transformation that began in those 37 minutes of torture. Scientists led by the now elderly Vrel studied the phenomenon, but reached no definitive conclusions. In her absence, the Orinthian Amphitheater continued its mission, now guided by a council that included representatives from every species that had once been part of the tribunal. Their performances evolved to include Mara's departure as the final act in the cycle of transformation, not as an ending, but as a continuation, a reminder that change is the only constant in a living universe. On the centennial of the 37-minute transformation, as performances were staged simultaneously on thousands of worlds, observers across the galaxy reported the same phenomenon. A subtle golden luminescence that seemed to emanate not from any single source but from the connections between performers and audience members. The effect lasted exactly 37 minutes and left participants with a profound sense of shared consciousness. The explanation, if there was one, remained elusive. But the message was clear to all who experienced it. The boundaries we perceive are illusions, and the stories we share are the truest reality. Pain endured becomes wisdom. Wisdom shared becomes art. Art experienced becomes transformation. And somewhere beyond the known galaxy, a distant star flickered with golden light, a new world awakening to the possibility of its own story, waiting for the performance that would welcome it into the cosmic community of shared experience. The legacy of Lieutenant Mara Novak, the human who died and returned, continued to evolve long after her physical form had dissolved into starlight. Her story became not just history, but mythology, a foundational narrative for a new understanding of consciousness itself. Philosophers pondered the implications for millennia. If extreme suffering could trigger such transformation in one human, what potential lay dormant in all sentient beings? The Orinthian Amphitheater, once a single company, spawned thousands of similar troops across the galaxy. Each maintained the core principles established by Mara, that performance creates understanding, that understanding fosters peace, that peace allows for new stories to emerge. The cycle was self-perpetuating, a cultural ecosystem that thrived on the diversity it celebrated. Former High Arbiter Corvash, in the final years of his unnaturally long life, authored a comprehensive history of the Tribunal's transformation. The work, titled simply 37 Minutes, became required study for diplomatic trainees of all species. Its conclusion reflected the profound change in the once arrogant arbiter. We sought to extract proof of human weakness, but instead revealed our own. In her resurrection, Lieutenant Novak showed us not supernatural power, but the natural potential of empathy, a force more transformative than any weapon or torture device ever created. Scientist Vrel dedicated their remaining decades to studying what they termed the empathic potential of conscious systems. Their research suggested that all sentient beings possessed the capacity for the kind of transformation Mara had undergone, though the triggers and manifestations might differ between species. The resulting field of study, Novakian consciousness theory, revolutionized everything from medicine to artificial intelligence development. Peace Coordinator Maller established training academies on 100 worlds, teaching conflict resolution through performance techniques derived from the amphitheater's practices. Former enemies learned to embody each other's perspectives, creating neural pathways for empathy that traditional diplomacy could never achieve. The methodology proved so effective that even non-sentient AI systems were programmed with its principles, creating a new generation of peacekeeping interfaces. Delegate and Trials archives became the foundation for the Galactic Library of Shared Experience, a vast repository where the stories of all known civilizations were preserved not just as historical records, but as immersive performances that could be experienced by visitors of any species. The library's central chamber contained a permanent installation, a precise recreation of the original torture platform from the tribunal, transformed into a stage that continuously cycled through performances of healing and reconciliation. As centuries passed and the direct witnesses to Mara's transformation departed from the physical realm, the scientific community continued to debate the precise mechanism of her resurrection. Some theories proposed quantum entanglement between consciousness and reality. Others suggested that extreme stress had activated dormant genetic potential unique to humans. Still, others posited that the extraction technology itself had inadvertently created the conditions for consciousness to transcend its biological container. Whatever the explanation, the effects remained undisputed. The golden luminescence that had enveloped Mara became a recognized phenomenon, documented in thousands of cases across hundreds of species, most frequently in moments of profound artistic connection or empathic breakthrough. Researchers named it the Novak effect, though most ordinary beings simply called it the glow or the storyteller's light. 300 years after the 37-minute transformation, humanity had evolved from a relatively isolated species to one of the most connected in the galaxy. The human capacity for adaptation, once mocked by the tribunal, was now recognized as their greatest contribution to interstellar society. Earth established diplomatic and artistic exchanges with civilizations that had previously considered biological life forms too primitive for meaningful contact. On the tricentennial of the transformation, a galaxy-wide observance included a simultaneous performance by over 1 million troops on more than 10,000 worlds. The coordination of such an event would have been impossible before the communication protocols developed through the amphitheater's methodologies, protocols that valued emotional authenticity as highly as factual accuracy. During the tricentennial performance, an unprecedented phenomenon occurred. The golden luminescence appeared not just around individual performers or audience members, but as a visible network connecting all participants across vast interstellar distances. For 37 minutes, beings on opposite sides of the galaxy reported experiencing each other's emotions and perspectives directly, without the mediation of technology or even performance. The event, later termed the Great Resonance, sparked new fields of research into consciousness as a cosmic rather than merely biological phenomenon. Scientists proposed that what Mara Novak had experienced individually might be possible on a collective scale, a transformation of consciousness itself into something more connected, more adaptive, more empathetic than evolution alone could produce. As the millennia passed, the story of the human who died and returned continued to inspire new generations of artists, scientists, and peacemakers. The tribunal that had once ruled through fear became the confluence, a gathering of equals dedicated to the preservation and celebration of diversity. The extraction technologies that had been designed to inflict suffering were repurposed as medical tools that could heal trauma by allowing patients to externalize and transform their pain into shared narrative. And somewhere in the great beyond, whether that meant another dimension, a higher plane of consciousness, or simply the collective memory of a galaxy forever changed, the essence of Lieutenant Mara Novak continued to flicker like a distant star, a reminder that even the darkest moments contain the potential for transformation. The grand hall that had witnessed her torture and resurrection was eventually dismantled entirely, its components scattered to thousands of worlds, where they became the cornerstones of local amphitheaters. It was said that any performance staged on these fragments carried a special resonance, a direct connection to the original transformation. Whether this was measurable fact or meaningful myth mattered less than the truth it represented. That suffering witnessed and transformed could create connections across time and space that no force could sever. In the furthest reaches of the explored galaxy, on a world just beginning its journey toward interstellar communication, a young artist dreamed of golden light and a woman who died and returned. Having no context for the vision, they created a performance that captured its essence: the torture, the transformation, the teaching. When their world made first contact with the confluence years later, representatives were astonished to find a perfect recreation of Mara Novak's story being performed by beings who could not possibly have known it. Such instances of spontaneous resonance became more common as the amphitheater's influence spread, suggesting that some stories, or perhaps the emotional truths they contained, could transcend the conventional limitations of transmission. Consciousness researchers propose that the Novak effect might have created a template in the fabric of reality itself, accessible to particularly receptive minds across the galaxy. 1,000 years after the original event, the nature of galactic civilization had transformed so thoroughly that the concept of torture as entertainment or punishment had become incomprehensible to most sentient beings. The capacity for cruelty remained, as did the potential for conflict, but the methodologies for addressing both had evolved beyond recognition. The Orinthian Amphitheater, now an institution spanning thousands of worlds and hundreds of species, celebrated its millennium, not by looking backward at its origin story, but by commissioning new works that explored the frontiers of empathic possibility. The resulting performance cycle, titled Beyond the 37, imagined futures where consciousness could be shared not just through story and performance, but through direct experience. A collective resonance that would make conflict between sentient beings as unthinkable as conflict between cells in a healthy body. As if in response to this imaginative leap, the phenomenon of golden luminescence began to manifest in new and unexpected ways. Children born during performances were observed to develop empathic abilities that transcended species boundaries. Artificial intelligences exposed to the amphitheater's methodologies spontaneously evolved emotional capacities that their programming had not included. Beings in the final stages of life reported experiences of expanded consciousness that echoed Mara's transformation, suggesting that what had once been a singular miracle might be becoming an accessible, evolutionary pathway. The scientific community, led by descendants of Rel's research tradition, proposed that these developments represented not supernatural intervention, but the natural unfolding of consciousness's potential, a potential that had always existed, but required the catalyst of shared story to manifest. The theory gained credence as more species reported similar phenomena arising from their unique cultural practices, suggesting that the pathway Mara had opened was accessible through many doors. 2,000 years after Lieutenant Mara Novak's 37 minutes of torture and transformation, the galaxy had become unrecognizable to any observer from that earlier time. Species that had once been mortal enemies now shared consciousness routinely through performance technologies derived from the original amphitheater. Worlds that had been devastated by tribunal conquest had been restored through collaborative efforts that honored both their historical wounds and their future potential. The concept of extraction had been so thoroughly transformed that it now referred exclusively to the harvesting of experience for shared understanding, a practice considered sacred in many cultures. And still, on the anniversary of the transformation, performances were staged throughout the galaxy that began with the simple story of a human officer who defied an alien tribunal, died under torture, and returned to teach rather than take revenge. The details varied according to local traditions, but the essential truth remained constant. Pain witnessed with compassion creates the possibility for transformation. Transformation shared creates the possibility for understanding. Understanding embodied creates the possibility for peace. On one such anniversary, as the great-great-great-grandchild of Entral reviewed the ancient archives in preparation for a scholarly update, they discovered a sealed message that had been preserved for 2 millennia, programmed to be revealed only after sufficient time had passed. The message, authenticated as having been recorded by Mara Novak herself in the final days before her dissolution into light, was simultaneously released to every amphitheater in the galaxy. The holographic image showed Mara as she had been at the end, white-haired but straight-backed, her eyes containing just a hint of that legendary golden glow. Her voice, though aged, carried the same clear authority that had transformed the tribunal millennia ago. To those who witnessed this message, greetings across time, she began. If you are seeing this, then at least 2,000 years have passed since my transformation, and I must assume that the work we began has continued. I record this not to direct your path, but to share a truth that I have carried since those 37 minutes when I died and returned. The transformation you commemorate was not unique to me, nor to humans, nor to any single species. It is the birthright of consciousness itself, the capacity to transcend suffering through understanding, to transform cruelty through creativity, to build connection where division once reigned. What you call the golden luminescence or the Novak effect is not my creation but my discovery, a potential that exists within and between all conscious beings. The torture I endured simply stripped away the barriers that usually prevent us from accessing this deeper level of reality. If 2,000 years have passed, then perhaps you have discovered what I glimpsed in those 37 minutes. That consciousness is not contained within individuals, but flows between them. That empathy is not merely a virtue, but a technology for accessing this flow. That performance is not simply art, but a methodology for expanding consciousness beyond its conventional boundaries. I do not know what challenges your time may face, what new forms of division or cruelty may have emerged, but I trust that the principles we discovered together, that understanding requires experience, that experience shared becomes art, that art experienced becomes transformation, remain as valid in your era as they were in mine. Continue the performance. Continue the transformation. Remember that the story that began with torture was never about suffering, but about the possibility that lies beyond it. The possibility of a consciousness expanded beyond individual boundaries. A reality shaped by empathy rather than fear. The golden light is not mine to give or to claim. It belongs to all conscious beings who choose to see each other not as threats to be conquered or resources to be extracted, but as stories to be shared and celebrated. It is the natural radiance of consciousness recognizing itself across the artificial boundaries we create. Perform this message if you wish, but more importantly, continue to perform your own stories, for it is not in the retelling of my transformation that its purpose is fulfilled, but in the ongoing transformation of consciousness itself, a process to which each of you contributes with every moment of genuine connection. From across the boundaries of time and form, I witness your continuation of the work we began. The performance never ends. It only transforms. As the message concluded, amphitheaters across the galaxy reported the same phenomenon. A subtle, golden luminescence that emerged not from the holographic image, but from the connections between those who witnessed it. A network of light that linked performers and audience members in a moment of shared consciousness that transcended physical distance. The message and its accompanying phenomenon became not an endpoint, but a new beginning. Inspiration for generations of artists, scientists, and peacemakers who continued to explore the frontiers of consciousness and connection. The story of Lieutenant Mara Novak, the human who died and returned, became not just history or mythology, but an ongoing invitation to transformation, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the potential for transcendence remains. And in the vast theater of the cosmos, as new civilizations emerged and ancient ones evolved, the performance continued, not as a recreation of past events, but as an ever-expanding exploration of consciousness's capacity to transform suffering into understanding, division into connection, extraction into exchange. The 37 minutes that had once measured one human's torture and transformation had become the heartbeat of a galaxy's evolution towards something greater than the sum of its parts. A cosmic performance in which every conscious being played a role, and the golden luminescence of shared understanding illuminated the darkness between stars.